Hello, I'm Marc DeSantis, and welcome to the Ancient Warfare podcast. Longtime listeners of the podcast may recognize me as a participant. Tonight, I'm going to be talking with assistant editor of the Ancient Warfare magazine, Murray Dahm, about his new book, Finis Britanniae. Finis Britanniae covers the end of Roman Britain, so looking back from it from our perspective. It's roughly the 3rd through 6th centuries AD. It's a dark period from our perspective. Incomplete historical sources, confused chronologies, shadowy warlords, and uncertain battles. Murray Dahm is taking the time out of his labors to shed some light on this subject for us. And his book is out now from Amberley. And I think that this is going to be a cracking episode. So why don't we get on with it without further ado? Hello, Murray.
Thank you for that lovely introduction.
So, Murray, why don't we start off with just the basic subject of the book, Finis Britanniae, the end of Britain. What made you choose this subject?
Well, I think you touched on it in your introduction, that it is indeed a dark age for us. And there's that, I say in the book that it's a peculiar one, because for the ancient historian, it's the end of the period. It's the closing of Roman Britain and the abandonment of Britain. And then a dark age where all of those things that you mentioned occur. We've got shadowy sources, incomplete sources, we don't knows, all that sort of thing. And for the medieval historian, it's the beginning of their period, emerging from the darkness. We then get the better informed medieval period coming from it. So it's that peculiar thing that falls in the gap between the two. Of course, it's also the age of King Arthur in Britain at the time, which is fascinating. And, there's as much literature on King Arthur as there is on almost any other aspect of ancient history. And he's one of these weird figures too, that he's technically late, very late Roman or very early Dark Age Britain, but he's also turned into a medieval figure, a thoroughly medieval figure in the popular imagination, shining knights and chivalry. And so that sort of, why does that occur where it does? And so for me, looking at this period and looking at those incomplete sources and the shadowiness and the we don't knows is a fascinating work in progress to say, well, what do we know? What can we extrapolate from these sources? What can we corroborate between them? Can we corroborate between them? And essentially look at something which shouldn't be we don't know. It can be more than we don't know. And, the 80,000 words of Finis Britanniae, I was like, oh gosh, there's a lot of there's a lot more than we don't know in that. And it's funny enough, there's huge gaps in our knowledge and huge dissatisfying uncertainties in the period still. But as a historian, it's a really interesting and exciting process to explore them and really get into depths with them and go, what does this mean? This is what another source says about exactly the same moment. The two seem to contradict one another. Is there any common ground between them? Why would one source say that when another source says this?
The sources themselves rarely seem to agree, even if there's some sort of, I don't even want to say general consensus, but let's just say a broad similarity. What are the major difficulties with doing history in this period?
I think the major issue is paucity of sources and the fact that the sources tend to, we have a couple of eyewitnesses in this century, generally not from Britain. We do have Gildas writing, and Gildas's sermon on the end of Britain is interesting because it's regarded as history. It's a sermon. It's, that would be like going to church today and hearing whatever the preacher said and saying, there's my historical source for a whole couple of centuries. That not going to be the best source, but that's all we've got in one sense. Later sources, who are generally regarded as better historians, Bede, I'll say the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, they're doing history looking backwards and reading things that we've lost, such as Gildas, but also, their priorities are different to what we would want in a historian, or they're localized and they're looking only beyond their locality with a very sort of vague eye. Bede is great for that. So there's that, but you've then got later historians still who are dealing with this material and have sort of absorbed other things. Whether that's accurate or inaccurate is one of the things. One of the historians I really like in the book is Henry of Huntington, who wrote a history of Britain and seems to have sources that we no longer have. But in the tradition of the period, he hasn't been utilized as an independent voice, that the sources he's using are not the same as what other sources use, because he gives more detail in certain points, especially in the Saxon invasions. So there's those, and then you've got other historians like Procopius and even Gregory of Tours, who are contemporaries, but they also are. Gregory of Tours, of course, was writing about the history of Francia and the Franks. Procopius is writing in Byzantium or Constantinople, and so their material on Britain is peripheral and sort of a by the by, and often, unfortunately, wildly inaccurate. Or is it? There's campaigns that only Procopius mentions, which are fascinating because no other surviving, well, I'll say, British source mentions it. You're like, well, hang on, why does Procopius mention it? Why is there this invasion from Anglia into the mouth of the Rhine in around 450 that only Procopius mentions it? So that's fascinating too, to try and insert that into what we know.
That was surprising because typically the invasions are only going one way.
Exactly.
You're going from the continent to Britain. And why don't you tell us a little bit about the invasions themselves? It's usually attributed to the Saxons and to a lesser extent the Angles and the Jutes. Mm-hmm. But what exactly happened during those centuries, especially maybe 4th, 5th, and 6th centuries?
It's a fascinating issue, that one of the reasons I go back as far as I do in the book. So I go back to the 3rd century, even the late 2nd, and look at the history of Britain as a Roman province, which takes its opportunities to split away from the empire. And it seems to be very vulnerable to anyone who's deciding to be a usurper in Gaul or Britain itself, to go, right, yes, we're with you. One of the reasons for that is, of course, that Britain is on the edges of the Roman Empire. They quickly feel isolated from what's going on in Italy. And if something bad happens, such as raids on the coast of Britain, it's very easy to persuade the inhabitants of Roman Britain that they're being neglected and forgotten. And so you get a multiple sort of range of usurpers who base themselves in Britain or get Britain to join their usurpation. And so as the centuries progress, and Rome's commitment to Britain until very late is substantial. There's 3 legions in Britain, a lot of men, even though they don't tend to be pushing forward any kind of a continued conquest after the 2nd century AD. So there's a big garrison in Britain, and those soldiers are, taken to other places in the empire. And whenever there's a usurpation, they get sent somewhere else, and new legions come in or new men come in and replace them. So by the late 4th century, you get a series of these usurpations, a series of crises in the Western Roman Empire, where Britain is denuded of troops. And so that seems to happen on 3 occasions in the 380s, and then in the early 5th century, and then in the 3rd time is in 310, around there, the usurpation of Constantine III. And each time you get that denuding of troops, and the traditional abandonment of Britain is 410 AD, the rescript of Honorius, which is in the historian Zosimus, who's another one of these sources, who is a compilation later in the East, tends to get derided as a historian, but he has some good stuff in him. Anyway, the rescript of Honorius is the Emperor Honorius basically writing a letter to the cities of Britain saying, you're on your own. And archaeology tells us, well, actually, there's Roman presence right up until about the 450s. That seems to be continued. So that solid single moment, history is very often not single moments, and yet the way we're taught history is single moments, dates, days, this day. You're like, well, actually, there's a whole nebulous thing around it. It took about 25 years for that one day to really take effect. But in Roman Britain, it's this one date, and Rome is denuded of troops and doesn't get them back. And so what I think happens at that point is Rome really does say, we're not going to put troops in Britain anymore. They've got other crises coming. They've got the Huns. They've got, various barbarian tribes, the Franks, the Vandals, the Alans coming through, Visigoths, name them, causing crises after crises in Italy, let alone on the edges of the empire in Britain. What those continental tribes also realize then is that Britain is now empty of effective military force and vulnerable. And so we get suggested in the sources that the population of Britain, the Romanized population of Britain, flees back to Gaul and Germania. And so there's basically not a terra nullius, but an emptier land than had been the case. And so, as you say, yes, they're generally all called Saxons, but there's Angles, which is why we use Anglo-Saxon to this day. But poor old the Frisians, the Jutes, the Danes are mentioned as a big invader at this time, which people go, well, that's the Vikings, that's later. And it's like, yeah, but the Danes are mentioned along with the Saxons and the Angles, and the Franks as well. There's so many tribes that are sort of described that we generally give them all under the Anglo-Saxon title. And in the sources, you'll find Saxon invasion meaning, well, actually, it was a Jutish invasion, or actually they were Angle brothers, or no, actually, they were Frisians. So all of that gets bandied around just under the Saxons. But I think the main reason, very long answer, is that the coast of Britain is seen to be vulnerable. It's seen to be wealthy in terms of the riches left behind, but also very quickly becomes not just plundering raids and Saxon pirates, which we get mentioned in the 4th century and the 3rd, but also, there's land there. We could just move in. No one's there. There's no one to resist us. Where population pressure or other factors in their homelands. Why don't we just all move to Britain? That's a very flippant way of talking about it.
So that's land hunger on the part of Saxons and in more broadly various Germanic peoples from the continent is easily understandable. It's the same thing that impelled them to cross the Rhine and go into France and Spain, yes, and what have you. What about the native Britons themselves? Because so you have what seems to be a Romanized populace in most of Britain south of Hadrian's Wall. But there must have been Britons who were not entirely Romanized, I would think. What was their reaction to the invasions of the Saxons? Were they crushed immediately? Did they fight back? What went on?
Well, of course, I forgot to mention the Caledonians and the Picts north of Hadrian's Wall, who are also looking on a vulnerable Britain and raiding themselves. And there is the first Saxon invasion. There's a correlation between the two, that it's Pict and Caledonian raids that the Britons are, we're told in the sources that as soon as the Romans leave, they forget how to fight. And so, they forget what warfare is, and they need to hire people in. And so the first Saxon invasion, which is Hengstenhauser, which we tend to date to either 449, it may be earlier, or in fact, there may be other Saxons invited in prior to that. They're invited in to fight off these Pict and Caledonian raids. And I think it's a fascinating aspect of this whole period what did the native Britons do who stayed, and even interestingly, the more Romanized Britons or more Romanized veterans of Roman units, what did they do if they stayed? And there's sort of vestigial remnants of all those figures in the history of the period. So you get Aurelius, who's the last Roman, who's, we're told whose parents were emperor and empress. We can't make that fit.
Wore the purple, I think they said.
Wore the purple, or was consul. So there's sort of these vague explanations of his lineage. So may have been a child of some magistrate in Britain who then becomes a sort of a champion of the local population to resist the invasions. And so what you find, I think, is that when the Roman army is withdrawn from Britain, however long that process took, the administration of Britain also doesn't collapse so much as it becomes single towns or smaller areas. We keep getting the title of dux, which is a Roman title. We get the title of comes, which is a Roman title. And, we've got duke and count that evolve from those. So those titles are an attempt to keep up with the continuity of what had worked and gone before. But there might also have been a reaction against it saying, what have the Romans ever done for us? And so a rejection of Roman organization and an independence, whether it be a county independence, as we sort of think happened in Cornwall, or an individual town that becomes like a new center of a smaller political entity. What causes issues then, of course, is that when an invasion comes and it's attacking a single town, that town can't really have the manpower to defend itself. And we do get suggested alliances, but they're very piecemeal and they're relatively ineffective. And one of the other issues, and you get this in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, and there's been scholars who attack the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle because the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle mentions most of these things, but it is a inexorable Saxon conquest. They never, they're very, very rarely defeated. They invade, they win, they invade, they win, and so the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle is a chronicle of success, which is understandable because by the 9th century when it's begun, you've got Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, Mercia and Wessex and things. So that, becomes England. So that's sort of, here's where we come from. So the idea that there was not a successful Britain pushback is something that a lot of historians can't deal with. And that is the context in which you get King Arthur, who is a successful, never beaten British victor at this time, who's pushing back against the Saxon invasions.
There seems to be the 12 battles it goes across several different sources. And what those 12 battles were isn't really part of my question. It's just that why do you think that there is a historicity to the 12 battles? And it seems that also the Battle of Mount Badon, wherever that took place, that's always the last and the crowning achievement of whoever fought there. So what is the meaning of the 12 battles and Mount Badon?
I think for Arthur, the 12 battles is the and an earlier source, the Welsh Annals, has 9 battles, but the 12 battles of Arthur are they've become traditional. And I think it's the never lost a battle, which immediately for the ancient historian calls up Alexander the Great. There's in fact very little detail on the 12 battles. They are very sketchy. The one that we have the most detail for, and in fact is the only historical battle that's corroborated in histories that don't mention the name of King Arthur, is indeed Mount Badon. And Mount Badon's interesting because it's where was it? And it's anywhere from the south of Britain to Edinburgh. And, and it's one of the fascinating things about Arthur is that every region of Britain can claim him. Is he a Welsh figure? Is he a Cornish figure? Is he a Midlands figure? Is he a Southern figure? Is he a Scottish figure? There's is Hadrian's Wall to do with King Arthur. All of them claim him to some degree, and it's amazing the number of British towns that have an Arthurian artifact or geographical feature. That's sort of the power of the figure that Arthur. And I don't believe that Arthur is a single individual at this time. I think that he's a kind of a compilation of an idea, and that the idea that there must have been a British hero to push back against these invasions appeals on a large scale to the local population of Britain. But the united British Empire that he represents never existed in this period. There's not a unification, there's a splintering. And that's why Britain is vulnerable. But the interesting thing about the Battle of Mount Badon, it's described in several sources who don't mention the name of Arthur as a siege, which tends to have people wanting to identify it with a hill fort, where a Saxon invader retreats to it and is then defeated over a 3-day battle. It's the only battle that really there's sufficient detail on. There are other battles that are being fought all the time. Sometimes they're just a name. Sometimes there's we won. And again, one of the factors I like about Henry of Huntington is he gives enough detail in his account of the Ella's invasion of what becomes the kingdom of Sussex, the South Saxons, to actually give a little bit more detail in his campaign, the 3 battles that he fights in the 470s to the 490s.
Now, from what I understand, with the legions gone and the Britons on the back foot fighting the Saxons, there was a reoccupation of the Iron Age hill forts that the Celtic Britons had occupied prior to the conquest by the Romans. Is there historicity to that? And because maybe Mount Badon was one of those forts that
I think
in this time for the Saxons.
I think there is. I wonder whether there was with the rejection of Roman administration and Roman systems, there could have been a reverting to the pre-Roman way of life. Now, that's tricky because, of course, the Roman Empire occupies Britain from 43 AD to 410, very vaguely. And so the idea that they would revert quickly to a culture that's 300 plus years old and abandon everything that had come and influenced them is false. We know that the various Roman villas continue to be occupied. They fall into disrepair and are eventually abandoned. Luckily for us, because that means we can discover them and they're not lost. We also know that, stone walls get robbed in various locations and used for other buildings. But then at the same time, substantial stone walls still exist in various parts of Britain, including London. And so that isn't true either. They must have still used Chester and York and, these other towns that have substantial walls still standing to this day and would have been defendable. Pevensey, the Saxon shore forts are another example of that, where these were defendable earthworks and stone walls, so they must have been used. But I think there may have been a reoccupation of older sites too, as almost as if the Saxons come, they're going to attack our town, let's embrace ancient knowledge, for lack of a better term, and go and occupy the hill forts, because most of the hill forts are not necessarily where later Roman settlements were built. And so despite the fact that several of them have no water source, or if you are under siege, they don't have a water source, you might find that they do get occupied, and there are finds in some of them which date to this period. I mean, this archaeologically is a very tricky period. And one of the things about the Time team on the BBC and then Channel 4 was they got very excited whenever it was a Saxon find, because that is it falls through the gaps. Roman's great, medieval's great, but Saxon's rare, and Anglian rarer still. I remember the excitement of a tour guide when we did a tour of York, that the Anglian tower on the walls of York was, one of the only Anglian period structures to exist in Britain. a thing that we can date to this period concretely, they didn't use concrete, is fascinating because it's so rare and it falls in the gap. So to be able to say this is a 5th century building is a really exciting one.
That's very interesting. So we have a situation, and I'm going to say now it's 500 AD. The Saxons are well established. They haven't conquered all of Britain yet, or let's just say that area that would become England, known as England, has not been conquered entirely yet. What would be the decisive, or was there a tipping point that made it inevitable that the Saxons would conquer England, that Roman Britain would eventually become what we now know of as Wales or Cornwall, what have you? Do we know of any situation or date at which resistance was decisively defeated, or were the Britons eventually just overwhelmed by too many Saxons?
Well, it's a fascinating one because the invasions are little ones. They're not, this is not the re-establishment or the reconquest of Roman Britain. And, by the end of Britain, by the end of Roman Britain, Britain is 5 provinces, not 1. It gets split into 2, then into 4, then into 5. It's not ever going to be let's reconquer and make single a Saxon Britain. And so the Norfolk, Suffolk, Kent, Sussex, Wessex, Mercia, these kingdoms that are eventually carved out amongst the Britons by the Saxon invaders and the Jutish invaders and the Anglo invaders, they're relatively small. They are surviving in some cases today in counties. So they're not big entities. And peculiarly, they are relatively independent. The kingdom of Sussex is eventually absorbed. The kingdom of Kent is eventually absorbed. But for, a century, that's it. It's the kingdom of Kent. And so it was enough for the invaders, and they obviously bring more shiploads of people over after they've established themselves. And so it was only ever going to be small. And eventually, when you get the eventual Anglo-Saxon kings of Mercia and Wessex, and anyone who's watched The Last Kingdom knows the history of the period, or indeed horrible histories. So, it's an internal conquest of Britain. And interestingly, that internal conquest corresponds to the next set of invasions, which are the Viking invasions and the creation of the Danelaw and, Viking Britain. Take Watling Street, and then north of Watling Street is Viking, and or northeast and southwest of Watling Street is British. But that idea of to resist the Vikings and then conquer the rest to become England, it's an internal motivation, and it's a peculiar internal motivation because it's a motivation that appeals backwards to Roman Britain. Whereas, if you go, the reverting of smaller kingdoms is very similar to the tribal kingdoms that existed before Rome came, even though they're not the same borders. And at the same time, you get places like Wales and Cornwall that resist that kind of conquest, that have their own language, that have their own cultural society, and are not unconquerable, but they are, for whatever reason, it's not a priority. And it's always fascinated me that Cornwall isn't fought over more, in terms of the Bronze Age even. And even although we call it the Iron Age and then we stop calling it, ages named after metals, Cornwall is one of the major suppliers of tin to Europe. Tin is in Cornwall and Afghanistan. So for the entire Bronze Age and for all of the bronze created in the Iron Age, you're dealing with trade links to Cornwall. And so there doesn't seem to be, in modern politics terms, and it's where analogous history falls down, all of the superpowers would be fighting over the control of Cornwall, because if you control Cornish tin, you control the bronze trade. You could really be an Apple or a Google if you control Cornwall. But that doesn't seem to be the case. it also ties into the ideas of King Arthur, if you think of him as a Cornish figure from Tintagel and Merlin's Cave and everything. That there's this independence and there's this you know, we fight alone, you know, kind of stuff. And it's fascinating because that comes out of somewhere, but it's very nebulous. It's not ever sort of talked about in the sources, and it's a fascinating sort of amassment of accidents, almost not accidents because there is some deliberate strategy going on, but it's not big strategy. It's not Roman Empire, re-establish Roman Empire. It's this little bit of land, or we'll add a bit. Oh, a generation will go by, we'll add a bit more. And one of the fascinating things about King Alfred, of course, is that he starts in a, you know, he's lost at the Battle of Ethandune. He's in the, is that the right battle? Oh, no, that's one of his successors. You know, he's lost one of the battles and he's, you know, hiding in a swamp. And from there, he creates what becomes England. So it's very much the sort of the waxing and waning of fortunes. But it's a fascinating picture. But I don't think it's not a linear picture. One of the big problems of the historian of hindsight, which of course as an ancient historian you have to be, is, oh, this is where it's going. And you're like, oh no, this is a roller coaster. This could have gone in a whole bunch of different directions. And you can't write the history of this knowing where it's going, because they didn't know where it was going. They had a plan, but that plan could have easily gone awry at any point.
I wanted to ask you about the actual writing of this book. So Finis Britanniae, which is out now from Amberley. This is not the first book you've written. You've written other books.
Yep.
And one of the questions I have for you is, how did writing this book, I believe you mentioned, is it 80,000 words, the manuscript? Okay, all right. How did it differ from writing other books?
It was good so the most of the other books I've written have been for Osprey, which are shorter, 30.
Right.
30,
Why don't you take the time to inform the audience what those are?
So I've written several titles for the Osprey Combat series, which looks at one warrior from a particular culture against a particular enemy. So I've varied, started with the Peloponnesian War in chronological order all the way through to Belisarius, and we've dealt with the Huns, the late Romans versus the Goths, Marcus Aurelius's Marcomannic War. I'm just finishing off one about the Dacian Wars of Domitian and Trajan. So looking at those. So they're fascinating because you're pitting one soldier type against another and choosing 3 battles to explore. This one was a different experience because it was me approaching the publisher and saying, do you like this idea for a book? So a much more traditional relationship, shall we say. It wasn't part of a series, which the Osprey books are. It's also good to be able to get your teeth into something in a 80,000 words. So you've really got the chance to dig your teeth in. Now, being me and being so verbose, I always go over word limits and then I have to pare them back. But I find it's always easier to cut down than to add in. You know, if you're like, here, the book's finished, and they're like, we need 5,000 more words. You're like, oh, where am I going to put those? For me, it was like, here, the book's finished. Okay, you need to cut 15,000 words. But of course, you then run into the problem of like, oh, how do I cut it? But it's a very good skill to have. One of the things I think with a lot of authors I've met is that when they submit their draft, it's perfect. It's every word is required. And when you then get your first copy edit back, you're like, oh, my precious baby. And the reality is that will need to happen for various different reasons. So it's always a really good skill to be able to edit yourself.
This had to have been a difficult book to write because you had such a multiplicity of sources and had to keep track of who said what. I mean, everyone from Gildas to Nennius to Henry of Huntington, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. My head hurt, and I was just reading it sometimes.
Oh dear! I don't want my readers' heads to hurt. But I think it's a fascinating one because it was written during lockdown, which was a peculiar period anyway, and it was a bit of it started with a kernel of Henry of Huntington and the conquest of Sussex by Ella and his sons. And so it starts then, and then it sort of expanded outwards. And so it got to a certain point where it was like, oh, well, I've expanded it this far. Why didn't I explore the gaps I haven't filled yet? And there are still gaps that I haven't really fully explored that could easily be additional chapters in terms of that. I've recently become fascinated with the kingdom of Soissons in Gaul at the same time in the 470s.
Right. That's Syagrius, I think.
Syagrius, yeah.
Right,
the last vestige of Roman control in
France,
northwestern France. Resisting the Franks and the Visigoths and the Alemanni.
Let us be clear: Northern Gaul until it became Northern France.
Yes, exactly. So it's between the Seine and the Loire. Which is a whole different aspect of the same period, right. And the sort of the collapse of Roman control. But so it was read that source, incorporate what that source says about XYZ into what you've already read and already written. And that then I like what a supervisor of mine once called the bibliographical bush, that you follow up a footnote or you follow up a reference, and that leads to another bushel of leaves, and then you follow up that and you follow up that, and there comes a point where you're on such a you're on the 8th footnote in the 8th source, and you're still digging, but enough. Stop now. This is enough. And that certainly is a part of it. And I think one of the things that's also fascinating about writing these books now, and I do like buying my own copies of books, but it's a period where virtually all of the sources are available in translation on the internet. You can read them all, and you can go to them all. I do like quoting sources rather than referring to sources and having someone go back to find another book. So it's all there for you. Here's what the source says. Here's an analysis of that source. Here's a comparison of that source with another source. That I really enjoy piecing together a history in that way, which is another advantage of the word count, that you've got the space and the time and the words to do that and really dig, and not just say, this source says this, take my word for it. This source says this. And I do indeed use translations, but I will then go into the Latin or the Greek and explore what the words mean. We've got Tyrannus Superbus for Vortigern, for instance, one of the figures who is one of these warlords who take over a small area of post-Roman Britain and invites in Hengst and Horsa to help him. They then rebel against him and sure enough soon carve out an empire of their own. But
if I could ask you about some of the names of various important figures in the book, whether it's Vortigern, Hengist, and Horsa, which means roughly the same thing, stallion and horse.
They're horse related, yes.
Or even Arthur, which could mean bear. But is there any possibility that some of these historical figures are actually the people of the time, or a little bit later, put a name to them to describe tribes, military units, or commands? Do you think, for example, that there really was a brother team called Hengist and Horsa, or were they two cavalry units that had standards with horses on them? Who knows?
Yes, I think you're right. I think that there's a whole variety of names which aren't names which are peoples, or, the horse-related terminology for Hengst and Horsa is odd. They are described as invaders, but they're invited in by Vortigern. They are foederati troops or laity troops. They are mercenaries. There's also the peculiar aspect of a later historiography of this period where it's Christian versus pagan. And one of the things I kind of get uppity about is, no, they're all Christians. No, they're not. They're pagans. No, they're Arian Christians. They were being Christianized for a century. They wouldn't be employed by Romans or even post-Roman Christians because the Britons are Christians. They're not pagans. They don't revert to paganism. They stay Christian. But they are embracing heretical beliefs, Pelagius and Arian especially, which the Nicene Christians, which becomes Roman Catholicism, or Eastern Orthodox Catholicism, has massive problems with and decides to wipe out. And there are wars in the 4th century between Arian and Nicene Christians. And so this whole idea that they're pagan is false, because you wouldn't invite in a pagan to help you. You would invite in a fellow Christian. Now, fellow Arian Christian, who later writers like Bede are regarding them as, heretical and therefore no better than pagans. And so therefore you get them termed as pagans. But it makes no sense, because they would have all been Christian by that point in time. When the Vandals invade, they're Christian. When the Visigoths invade, they're Christian. The Huns aren't, but all of the Gothic tribes before the Huns, they're all Christians, which we kind of can't. But Christian versus Christian, that makes no sense. Yeah, they're all looking for land and plunder. They've all got different cultural ideas. And I think there's a parallel again made with the pagan Vikings. But weirdly, after the Vikings are Christianized, they're still Vikings and they still invade and plunder. But anyway, now I digress. The other aspect of that is that, yes, there's these figures whose names are, they are not necessarily individuals. They could be sort of trends given a face, if you like, or an individual who is named to represent an entire phase of history and invasion. And certainly some of these individuals we have more information of than others. Some of them, of course, their names are surviving in the names of parts of the Isle of Wight, Whitgar, the Jute. Their name survives in the name of the county, or in the name of the town, or in the name of the, Portsmouth is, and they're named after Porter. Are those, the name comes after the place? So was the place called Portsmouth or Portchester? Oh, the guy who invaded's name was Porter. It seems a little, which way round did it happen? And so, there's several of those. And I think it's, again, one of the problems of our sources, that they will talk about a person. You can then impose it's not a person, it's a trend. Very hard to then go, here's my evidence of the trend. There are names in other parts of history. Hengist is an unusual name. And I have one of the appendices in the book which explores whether the Hengist in Anglo-Saxon history is the Hengist in the story of Beowulf. And, is it the same person? And it can fit. But that is a fascinating, you've got a story set in Sweden in the Dark Ages, which is exactly the same age, talking about a figure who, if it is the same figure, there's a whole period of other history subsequent to him in Beowulf that occurs in Britain. And that may be a false thread. They may not be the same person, but it can be made to fit. But one of the reasons it can be made to fit is that we know so little. I can put these two figures together, and there are several of those that happen in actual history. What was the revolt I was reading about recently? Somewhere in, was it North Africa? Where the two rebels, one good, one bad, are both named the same name. And you're like, wait, what? It's like Boris or something. There's good Boris and bad Boris. And you're like, that sounds made up. But there's textual, epigraphical evidence that they're both of these names. So it does happen in history. So, and some of us today have names which, my name, for instance, means sailor. I'm not a sailor. I haven't been to sea. But if I went to sea and did something, and someone points out that Murray is from Murphy and means sailor, oh, how likely is that? Well, it happens. So, and if you meet someone whose name is Ironmonger as a surname, and they're an ironmonger, or, butcher and they're a butcher, or smith and they're a blacksmith, we might turn around and go, well, no, but there's a weird, well, that's how the names came about. If that
Right.
person happens to still be in that trade, you can't deny that they're in that trade because their name matches the trade. Whereas in 1500 years' time, could quite easily say, no, he wasn't actually an ironmonger. His name was Ironmonger, or the other way around. He wasn't actually named Ironmonger. He was an ironmonger. So that may be happening in this period too. It's very hard to tell.
It is a difficult period to keep track, to wrap your head around, or all of the events, keep track of all of what was going on, because, as I mentioned at the outset, the chronologies are confused, the sources are incomplete. There's nothing that actually goes from the full extent of or beginning of the period towards the end. There's certainly no linear narrative to follow. Many of the sources that are closest in time, or for example, Gildas is a sermon, which is not necessarily what you would want to base most of your material on, historical material on. Many of the other sources that you have, such as the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, are not meant to be examinations of the end of Britain from the Roman Celtic viewpoint. It's more about the Saxons, but once again, a lot of maybe suspect motive there. What about Henry of Huntington? Because I didn't know much about him prior to reading your book, and I was wondering, why is it that he's not better known?
So he, in terms of the bizarre, so he's writing in the 12th century, in the 1130s. There's this peculiar, and this was another rabbit hole I went down and went, Murray, this is a different book. There's 4 authors of Britain and Arthur writing at the exact same moment. And, God, can I call them, is Henry of Huntington, Geoffrey of Monmouth is the victor in this literary war. He's the one whose picture wins out as the picture of what's happening. And yet when you read Geoffrey of Monmouth, it's fantasy. He makes stuff up. And the funny thing about that is he says in his preface and his epilogue, trust me, don't trust these other guys. And he names them. I've read books that they don't have access to. So, trust me on this history. And yet his history is so outlandish. And, there's a Arthurian worldwide empire that is pitted against the Romans. And you're like, whoa, this is messed up. But for some reason in the 12th century, perhaps to do with the anarchy at the end of Henry II, when you get Stephen of Blois and the Empress Matilda fighting over who's going to be the King of England, this seems to be a period where they're writing about a similar anarchical period of British history. And there's basically a literary English history business. So you get the Life of Gildas by Caradoc, you get the Henry of Huntington, Geoffrey of Monmouth. Who's the 4th one, Murray? Is it Roger of Wendover? Maybe. Oh, I can't remember off the top of my head. And there's this, Gerald of Wales has already done. Is it Gerald of Wales? Maybe it's Gerald of Wales. Anyway, sorry. There's 4 of them, all writing at exactly the same time, named by the others as being inferior to my book, which has happened in authors ever since.
They want the book sales.
They did want the book sales, although, we're talking 20, not hundreds. But the funny thing about that is I think they are exploring this period at that time. And as I say, Geoffrey's picture wins out. And for a long time, Geoffrey is the dominant picture of English history until it starts to get questioned. I think around the 16th century, it starts to get, must be earlier. Certainly in Arthurian terms, what you then get is the dominance of Thomas Malory in the 15th century. And that really lasts until the 19th century. That's the main picture of Arthur you get is Thomas Malory. Now, for all of that, they are writing their versions of English history. And they are using, generally speaking, the same sources, Bede, Gildas, Nennius. And what struck me about Henry of Huntington was all of a sudden, when he's following along what Bede tells us and what Gildas tells us and what Nennius tells us, suddenly there's these huge explosions of, and what the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle tells us, suddenly there's these huge explosions of information, which some people have said, oh, he made it up. And you're like, but it's verifiable that this is unlikely something he would make up. And I make that point about the Battle of Pevensey and then the invasion, the South Saxon invasion by Alla. There's 3 battles where there's more detail than any other source provides. And those other sources say he invaded, fought a battle, fought another battle. That's it. Very, very slim. So the fact that Henry then packs it full of detail, and I don't think it's throughout his history. There's a period where he starts, and it's exactly the same as we find in Bede and the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. Then he seems to have a source that we've lost, that he gets more detail from, and I think it's reliable detail. And then after a certain point, he reverts to being very similar to Bede and the other sources we've got. So it's like he seems to have had something else for that period. I mean, that's again what is a fascinating aspect of being a historian, because we've got the same sources being used by multiple sources. You can indeed read Bede and Gildas and the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle and Nennius. And then these later 12th century and others read those same sources, quote them differently, or we're relying on a turn of phrase in a 12th century source or an 11th century source. And it's, oh, what's he mean when he says that? Because that's not what Bede says. Bede says this instead. And you find that with Mount Baden. For instance, he calls it a siege. This guy's not calling it a siege. He's calling it a battle. And you can get into the nitty-gritty of variations in language and what they might mean and what the ramifications for them are. So that's a fascinating aspect. Normally, of course, in ancient Roman and Greek terms, you're dealing with sometimes you're dealing with a more complete picture. But in terms of Anglo-Saxon history, you're often dealing with a very incomplete picture. And here you are arguing about minutiae when there's vast spaces of no knowledge around your little minutiae argument.
The sheer specificity
nice.
of the detail, I think, lends credibility to it. That is, it's circumstantial.
Yes, but what's happening on a particular point of British soil in 470 AD, and you're like, well, what's happening in the rest of Britain? Well, we don't know. We only seem to have a picture of a teeny tiny point of land. The rest of Britain is a shadowy place at this point in time.
He had a local newspaper,
exactly,
and that was the missing source.
So yeah, it's fascinating.
Yeah. Murray, it has been a pleasure to chat with you today. And it's a fascinating read, Finis Britanniae. I encourage everyone to go and get themselves a copy. It's from Amberley, and it should be in your local bookstore or available via online retailer as we speak. Is there anything else that we should know about your book? How to get it?
There's so much to say. I didn't mention the Notitia Dignitatum.
Okay.
Things that are fascinating, but are they appropriate? The Notitia Dignitatum is this document which talks about the officers of the Roman Empire and lists the soldiers enlisted under each one. Some point in the late 4th, early 5th century, I do use it to suggest what units may have been in Britain at the point when Britain ends. Weird thing about it is that we say 410 for the abandonment of Britain. Generally speaking, the Notitia is up to 420. So it's like, hang on, are these units still in Britain when Britain's abandoned? Hang on a minute, that doesn't make any sense. So, but there's fines and things. So I find it useful not to say this is definitely what was here and definitely who was here. I'm a suggestion of remnants and veterans who may have stayed to create a small veteran corps of the soldiers who would go on to fight the Saxons, generally unsuccessfully, but still. I
also noticed that you included some references to, because Murray, I'm going to call you Murray of Dom now, okay?
Nice.
In honor of, just like Henry of Huntington and Geoffrey of Monmouth, Murray of Dom. You've also written some scenarios, I guess, for Hail Caesar from Warlord Games.
About the 12 battles of King Arthur.
Right. And I think it would be very interesting to run a scenario in which maybe a remnant and one of those auxiliary units from the Notitia Dignitatum was fighting off a band of Saxon raiders or something like that. And maybe some of them did survive. Maybe they held on, it became a hereditary thing where maybe their sons of the soldiers took up their father's work until they were finally, either, melded into the local British population and were indistinguishable or driven out by the Saxons. But that's another interesting aspect I found about your book.
Absolutely.
So there's another layer there for everyone to
and I mean, the scenarios were for a wargaming perspective, so you were looking to replay battles, and the fascinating thing about them is we know so little specifically about these battles, but we know a lot more generically about warfare in the period. Shield walls, and even if we're using late Roman models to say this is probably the similar style of warfare that was continued, because as you say, the Roman units, the auxiliary units, and even the remnants of the legions have equipment and training that fathers would have passed on to sons and vice versa. So similar, Roman shields, Roman spatha, and mail coats continue into the next period. So right. It's a fascinating thing, but I think it's one of those aspects of history exploring the possibilities. And I've said it before that I like to speculate beyond the realm of reasonableness, because you can then pull it back and say that was unreasonable. And so you're like, oh, but okay, if that was unreasonable, let's pull it back one step. Is that unreasonable? No, that's still reasonable. That's, it's getting to the extreme extent of reasonable extrapolation, but it's still reasonable. And you go that one step beyond, you go, that's unreasonable now. And you're like, okay, we'll come back to this limit of reasonable extrapolation and, guesswork. And I find that is a fabulous thing to do. And obviously, if you've got a different hat on, if you've got a wargaming hat on, or a historical fiction hat on, or a fantasy hat on, those limits are, well, limitless perhaps, but also they change, they move and vary. And so it depends what you're and why you're looking, that you can basically take any inspiration from a historical period for any purpose.
Well, okay then. Well, thank you, loyal listeners. Thank you for joining us this evening. Once again, as I said before, a fantastic book, Finis Britanniae. Go and get yourself a copy. All right.
Thank you.
Murray, thank you for joining us.
Absolute pleasure.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.